President Jair Bolsonaro started off his participation at the G20 summit in Osaka in the worst possible fashion. He had to deal with a scandal when an Air Force officer flying with the presidential convoy was caught carrying 39 kilos, yes, kilos, of cocaine in his hand luggage.
A member of the Brazilian president's G20 entourage has been arrested for suspected drug trafficking following a cocaine bust.
And he was also facing scrutiny from world leaders for his lack of environmental concerns. I mean, between January and June 2019, the Brazilian Amazon has lost the equivalent of 320,000 football fields to deforestation. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she wanted a straight talk with the Brazilian president.
Dramatisch finde, was dort zurzeit in Brasilien geschieht.
Then, all of a sudden, the narrative changed, thanks to something happening thousands of miles away from Osaka. South American and European negotiators agreed in principle to a deal between the European Union and Mercosur, which will form the largest free trade zone in the world. This week, we're talking about the implications of the deal for Brazil. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil. Monica de Bolle is the director of Latin American Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks for being back to our podcast.
Thank you for having me once again on the podcast.
It took decades to get pen to paper on this deal. What pushed it over the hump?
This has been a deal that's been 20 years in the making. So it's kind of difficult to attribute it to the success of it to any single administration. Every administration along the way, I think, has had, its successes and failures and inputs and whatnot. The Temer administration was really trying to push this deal very strongly over the finish line, but conditions were just not right for that to happen at the time. And right now conditions were. And by that I mean that the geopolitical context is one where the EU is very clearly concerned about having as many free trade agreements with as many countries as they can. If we just look at, in regions, if we just look at the number of trade agreements that they have negotiated since 2017, they've done one with Canada, they've done one with Mexico, they've done one with, now they've done the Mercosur one, they're trying to finalize one with Vietnam, which is at the very end of getting finalized. So they've been going that route essentially as a sort of response to U.S. protectionism and as a way to ensure that they have proper access to markets and can adequately diversify away from the U.S. market given Trump's protectionism and given the threats that Trump has made against the EU.
Professor, this deal will have 17 chapters, but so far we've only been shown a short summary of 17 pages. Knowing that this is a document containing only the broad strokes of the deal, what were your first impressions? Is it a balanced deal?
It is not unusual to announce the conclusion of, the broad negotiations or the big picture negotiations on the trade deal of this magnitude, and then not release the final text immediately, because the final text really can only be final after the agreement and all of its chapters undergo the necessary legal and technical revisions that all countries will then undertake individually. So the final agreement we will only see after that process has been concluded. The only thing that does have a little bit more detail is the part about market access. And here's another thing that needs to be known about trade deals. Most people tend to look at trade deals and think that, they're all about market access. Trade agreements are actually much more than that. Market access is only one part of the story. Then the other part of the story has to do with all sorts of regulations and other issues that affect trade and affect investment. And from that, I think what has at least my first reaction from reading it, although a lot of detail is still needed to make a proper assessment, is that there has been a very significant opening of access to markets, both on the Mercosur as well as on the EU side, for industrial goods. So on the EU side, they're basically allowing the equivalent of 100% of tariff lines of industrial products to now come from the Mercosur into the EU. From the Mercosur side, what's happening is that they're now allowing something like 90+% of tariff lines of products from the EU, industrialized products, to come into the Mercosur. And then there's a side agreement or a side deal on passenger vehicles, which hasn't been detailed in this document. I mean, the details that are there are very broad brush and difficult to analyze. On the industrial side, it looks as if, there's been significant market opening on both sides, and it's pretty much level. It's pretty much level on both sides.
And what about agricultural goods?
When you look at the agricultural part, however, although there is market opening clearly, otherwise, why make a deal? It is less level. So the impression that I had reading it is that the agreement seems to favor the EU more, or in other words, keep EU agricultural markets more protected, while the Mercosur countries seem to have made a lot more concessions to the EU on access to their agricultural markets. And on top of that, on agriculture specifically, what the EU has been doing, and the Mercosur deal has not been an exception, with all of these other trade deals that they've been negotiating that I mentioned earlier, they're making countries accept their sanitary and phytosanitary standards. The same is true now for Mercosur, and this is a non-negotiable part of the deal. So Mercosur countries will have to accept the sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions that the EU applies to agricultural products. And that obviously, can mean that in some cases you might still see, barriers being erected if the EU feels that or thinks that, there are problems with some agricultural exports coming in from Mercosur and things like that.
Brazilian beef has been blocked by the European Union due to sanitary issues, right?
Yes, we have. So basically the EU has maintained those measures in place for products like beef and other types of meat. So that, in the future, if problems arise in Mercosur that, somehow do not meet the measures or the requirements, the sanitary and phytosanitary measures that the EU has, then you can see that there would be a closing up of those markets for Mercosur countries, as we have seen in the past.
Both European agriculture and Brazilian industry are heavily dependent on aid such as subsidies, tax breaks. How does the deal approach that?
It does mention, there's a part of the document that mentions subsidies explicitly, and it basically it's very vague. It basically says that the deal now does not contemplate any subsidies being applied further in any product area, but it is hard to gauge from that very vague statement. It's actually a paragraph. From that very vague paragraph, what in effect this entails. There are what we in trade call snapback clauses, which allow countries to quote unquote retaliate or apply remedies, trade remedies, whenever there are situations that don't meet the standards that are in the deal. And there are things like that pertaining to subsidies, but we don't know exactly how that's been worded in the agreement because that's not clear from the 17-page text.
Mercosur manufactured goods will no longer be taxed when shipped to Europe, but is Mercosur competitive in that respect? So
2 important points here. First of all, the broad tariff reduction doesn't happen immediately. It happens over a period of 10 years. That's the contemplated time period to reduce tariffs on all the goods that are seeing their tariffs reduced, and that's the case for the EU as well as for Mercosur. On your question specifically, there's a huge market now for Mercosur manufacturers to explore. But obviously, what this means is that those manufacturers have to be competitive because there are many countries that export manufactured products into the EU. The EU itself, its own companies are very competitive internationally. So, Mercosur countries would now be competing hand on hand with these European companies. That can have two effects. It can have a very positive effect in sort of when you have this type of market access in a situation like this, it can force companies that have been operating in a very protected environment. It can force companies to upgrade and modernize, their production structures, their practices. It can even, push them to integrate supply chains in a better way than they have been in the past. I mean, certainly in the case of Brazil and Argentina, these are two countries where their industrial sectors respectively have not been involved in or have not been part of supply chains anywhere. So there's now an incentive for that to happen. But on the other hand, because these are companies that have operated in such a protected environment for such a long period of time, there's a challenge for these companies to be able to really reap the benefits of having this type of market access. So to be seen exactly what the end effects are going to be. I tend to think that, trade openness in the longer term always ends up having, this is not just me, this is empirical research shows this, it does end up having broad benefits for all of the economies involved, which is not to say that you can't have, some sectors of the economy or some specific terms that actually lose out from trade. We know that happens too. But by and large, the gains are bigger than the drawbacks, and that's an important point to keep in mind. But by and large, I think having a market where Mercosur companies are actually incentivized to meet the standards that the other company, their competitor companies have in order to compete themselves, it should be a positive thing and should help these companies upgrade.
Do you think it's fair to expect a negative hit in the short term? I mean, left-wing parties and trade unionists are saying the deal could destroy Brazil's industry.
Well, that depends on the degree to which Mercosur countries will want to enter more aggressively into the EU market, right? Because when it comes to the opposite effect, so EU companies entering Mercosur markets, the fact of the matter is that a lot of EU companies have already been, or European companies have already been present in Mercosur markets for a very long time. So, if you just think of the car makers, for example, you've got, the entire car industry within Mercosur is essentially either European or American. So you've got all of these car makers in these markets already. In other areas like cement production or, there are others that come to mind, you also have European companies already in Brazil or in Argentina, producing heavily to sell into those markets specifically. So the fact is that at least on the manufacturing front, even though we didn't have a free trade agreement in place with the EU, what the EU did do was set up companies in our markets in order to, compete locally with domestic firms. So the competition is already happening and has already happened to a very, very large extent in local markets.
About a quarter of our listeners are located in Brazil, so I bet this question will strike a chord for them. How long will they have to wait before finding affordable and good wine from Burgundy in Brazilian supermarkets?
Well, I think that's going to take a while yet. I mean, there is a section of the 17-page summary that talks specifically about wine and cheese. So, those barriers are going to be reduced, and we should see the prices of those things coming down in the Brazilian market, in the Argentinian market, and all of that. But This will happen when the deal actually comes into effect, right? And it will still take a while for the deal to come into effect, not just because of the legal and technical analyses and evaluations that have to be done, which I mentioned before, but also because this deal needs to be ratified by the different parliaments in every single country. So that's another tall order right there. I mean, today we've seen, today and recently we have seen the French authorities and a number of members of a number of French farmers and others expressing concerns about the EU Mercosur deal. There's a chapter in the deal that speaks specifically of sustainable goals and environmental sustainability. Those could be used, those measures that are in the agreement, which we don't know the detail of, they could be used to say, certain countries are not doing enough or are doing badly on the environmental front, and we can't ratify the deal. I mean, there's still a lot of potential stumbling blocks in the next, God knows how long. It could take quite a long time towards ratification of all the different parliaments. So this is not close to being finished anytime soon.
After the break, we will talk about Brazil's place in world trade. We'll be right back.
Hey, I'm Ewan Marshall, editor of The Brazilian Report. I want to invite you to subscribe to our brand new sports newsletter. Every Monday morning, we talk about all things Brazilian sports, and it's not only about football. We also cover other sports, as well as plenty of behind-the-scenes political stuff and cultural aspects, and also the business side of sports. Our sports newsletter goes beyond the scores, and it's free, so just go to Brazilian.report and you can get it in your inbox.
By any measure, Brazil is one of the most insular economies in the world. For example, when we look at how much exports and imports represent in percentage of GDP, compared to other G20 countries, Brazil ranks dead last in imports, only 12% of its GDP, and second last to Argentina when it comes to exports, with 13%. So, Professor Monica de Bolle, how did we create this sort of self-imposed embargo?
Well, it's the reflection of many, many years of having an import substitution mentality, right? I mean, both Brazil and it's not by chance that it's both Brazil and Argentina in that bucket, because both of those economies have been focused on import substitution since way back when. We've been doing import substitution in one way or another since the 1930s. So, and our mentality hasn't really changed. It's going to have to start changing now. I think that that explains the numbers that you've just cited to me. On the one hand, it also explains the extreme concerns that you see voiced by parts of the Brazilian establishment, or some companies, or not even companies, but economists and others that still do have, whether they know it consciously or not, this kind of import substitution mentality that really has to go, because import substitution did not work. When we compare, the stories of Argentina, Brazil, and then the Asian countries, what we did differently from the Asian countries is that we stuck to import substitution and import substitution only, whereas the Asian economies like the Koreas of the world and the Taiwans of the world and so on, what they did is, yes, they protected their industries, but at some point they realized that opening up to trade was more important than protecting their industries. And when they felt that it was time, they opened up their economy substantially and allowed their companies to be exposed to a competitive environment that made those companies naturally grow, modernize, and integrate themselves into the global economy. So a lot of the difference in the success stories of, Korea, Taiwan, and Argentina and Brazil, and I cite those countries specifically because those development pushes happen more or less around the same time. They were all post-war, post-Second World War pushes towards development. Where you saw more import substitution industrialization, Argentina and Brazil, these failed. They did not succeed.
As you say, empirical evidence does show that opening up one's economy is beneficial to a country, and we only need to look at our past history. In the 1990s, Brazil underwent a series of liberalizing reforms that helped curb poverty rates, employment, etc.
Yeah, so in the early 90s, we had this push for trade liberalization that was very unilateral. I mean, the liberalization that happened in the 90s was not about trade deals. So it was not about making trade deals with other countries. It was about just unilaterally reducing tariffs. Brazil used to have extremely high tariffs on a number of products, and what it did back then was basically reduce dramatically, and in some cases, really very dramatically, a lot of these tariffs. And it was a very turbulent time for Brazil. We had a hyperinflation, we had an economy that was completely disorganized, but in spite of all that, the effects of the reduction in tariffs and the opening up and the trade liberalization efforts that were put in place certainly helped the economy navigate those extremely turbulent times. So, there's one additional thing here that we haven't mentioned that I think we should bring into this conversation, at least when we talk about tariffs. When we talk about tariffs and when we talk about opening up to trade, we generally tend to focus a lot on the exporting capacity of the country. So we tend to think of things like, Brazilian exporters, are they going to have greater access to other markets and things like that? But trade is really about not just exports, but a lot about imports. And it's through imports, actually, that you're better able to export quality goods and higher value added goods. So the export and import side go hand in hand. So just to make a point here, usually big exporting companies are also very big importers. They import a lot to export a lot.
To illustrate Brazil's dependence on the U.S., economists used to say that when Washington sneezed, Brasilia would catch pneumonia. Today, as China emerges as Brazil's top trading partner, can we change that phrase, replacing D.C. for Beijing?
I think it applies to both. I don't think we have rid ourselves from catching, very strong, potentially life-threatening diseases when anything happens to the U.S., just as we are at risk from any slowdowns in China. So I think we are now pretty much exposed to both, kind of equally, actually.
And would diversifying trading partners through trade deals be a way out of this over-dependence on just two countries, even if it's the world's top two economies?
It certainly helps.
Thank you, Professor, for once again making yourself available for the Explaining Brazil podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
This podcast was written and prepared by me, Gustavo Ribeiro. Ewan Marshall edits the final script. If you like this show, please rate us on your podcasting platform. That's really important for us, and it will only take a second. And go check our website. You can enjoy our exclusive content on Brazilian politics, economics, and society, and we let you try everything out for 7 days. That goes for articles, newsletters, you name it. Just go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. That's all for now. See you next week.